Time takes a cigarette, puts it in your mouth. You pull on your finger, then another finger, then a cigarette. The water wall is calling, it lingers, then you forget. Oh, ho, 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 you're a rock and roll suicide. You're too old to lose it, too young to choose it. And the clock waits so patiently on your song. You walk past the cafe, but you don't eat when you've lived too long. Oh no, 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 you're a rock and roll suicide. Shift break for snarling as you stumble across the road. But the day breaks instead, so you hurry home. Don't let the sun blast your shadow. Don't let the milk float rob your mind. They're so natural, religiously unkind. Oh no, love, you're not alone. You're watching yourself, but you're too unfair. You've got your head all tangled up, but a car can only make you care. Oh no, love, you're not alone. No matter what or who you've been, no matter when or where you've seen, all the knives in a lacerate your brain. I've had my share, I'll help you with the pain. You're not alone. Just turn on with me, and you're not alone. Let's turn on and be not alone. Give me your hands, 'cause you're wonderful. Give me your hands, 'cause you're wonderful.
Good afternoon, everybody. I meant to say when I introduced the previous speaker, I wanted to thank Startup Week, or the organizers. They have put in a tremendous amount of work, and seeing all these people in Groover Labs day after day, it's warming the cockles of my heart, let me tell you. So thanks. Welcome to the 3 p.m. session, choosing a co-founder and how to find the one. I'm curious about that myself. I just want to say this session is part of the Martin Pringle pre-revenue track. I know James covered Martin Pringle, regional law firm here in town, and we have more about them. It's probably available on the website. And now I would like to introduce our speaker. Melissa Vincent is the Executive Director of Pipeline Entrepreneurs. I'm sure we've all heard about that or heard of that. She is a founder, investor in people, startups, and communities. Please help me welcome Melissa to Groover Labs and Startup Week. Nice to see you again. Do you have a, oh, you have
I have, yeah. Chris, am I good? Awesome. Well, thank you guys so much for having me. I am, as Tracy mentioned, Melissa Vincent. I am the Executive Director of Pipeline Entrepreneurs. We are a fellowship for high-growth entrepreneurs who happen to call the Midwest home. And you guys are very familiar, I'm sure, with some of our amazing Wichita entrepreneurs here. Give a little shout out to my people back there. So today's topic is finding the one. Also, we could say it's finding the one and also avoiding the wrong ones. So we're going to start with that. How many of you here have a co-founder? Just raise your hand. Okay. I'm not going to ask you if it's a good relationship or not, because that's a very personal question. But when you are trying to find your co-founder, there are a lot of ways that can go well, and that can go south in a lot of ways too. So what are we going to talk about today? Little bit of an agenda. We're going to talk about, do you need a co-founder? How do you find your co-founder? How do you compensate your co-founder? And worst case scenario, breaking up with your co-founder, which we hope never happens. So just a question for the room, because I am like interactive conversation. So what's the worst possible outcome that could happen if things go south with you and your co-founder? Yes?
They take all your IP hostage.
Sounds like you might know what you're talking about there. Yes, very, very bad scenario. Yes. Trevor. You murder each other. That's
worst case.
I mean, like, yes, that's definitely something that we hope never happens. Yes.
Contracted for another company in the same industry.
Ooh, ouch. Yeah, any others? Divorce. Sad but true. I've been there. I can speak to that. Yes. Anybody else? Okay. So there's a lot of things that can go south, but what's the best outcome? What's the best thing that could happen with you and your co-founder? You exit, you make millions of dollars. It's great. So given that, when we're talking about this, clearly the weight of the potential negative outcomes, there's a whole lot more that can go wrong than what can go right. So typically, I start at the beginning, but in this talk, we're actually going to start at the end. We're going to start with the breakup. Let's just knock it out, get it out of the way. And the reason for that is because I am very big on worst case scenarios and figuring out what's the worst thing that can happen. You plan for that and you go from there. So basically, relationships can end for a lot of different reasons. We have just heard a couple of them here, and they can go south for any number of different reasons. So how do you protect yourself? That's really what we want to talk about today. The best way that you can protect yourself when it comes to your relationship with your co-founder is to have an incredibly strong operating agreement. So since we're talking about your co-founder relationship as it relates to kind of relationships in general, think of your operating agreement as your prenup. Your prenup is going to tell you everything that is going to happen should the relationship end. And while you hope that it doesn't, there is a reason why Hollywood attorneys get paid a lot of money, because you want to make sure that if things don't go well and it does end, that you are protected and your assets are protected, in this case, your company. So one of the things that I always tell people, and this is like the biggest point to remember, is you need to have really strong legal counsel. There's a lot of people that can come into your life, but when you're starting your company, getting this part right, your operating agreement, your founder agreement, is such a critical piece, because as we pointed out earlier, there are so many ways that can go south and can go wrong. You need to make sure that you have your operating agreement in order and that it talks through some of the things that we're going to talk about today, so that should worst case scenario happen and you and your co-founder need to break up, it's clear who's going to get what and how that's going to go. So let's talk about some worst case scenario logic here. We're going to talk through a couple different scenarios of ways that this could go south. So the first one is dealing with the devil. And that is because the devil is in the details. And sometimes the devil knows more than you do, and you need to be prepared. So I'm going to give you a personal example on this one. So I had a co-founder in a software development firm, and when we first became partners, his thing to me was, hey, I don't want us to have to do an equity split or anything, so I'm just going to set up as a contractor. So I'm going to do the software development, we'll set it up as a contractor agreement, and in my mind, that was fantastic. I thought, great, company's solely mine, I have a contractor arrangement, I'm protected, everything's great. So we did software development, and it turned out in that case, being vulnerable here, that there was no code. We got a ways in and there was no code. So when that was uncovered, any of our clients, thankfully none of them sued us, but they could have. And if they were going to sue us, they would have had to go through me, not him, because he was a contractor. So what I initially saw as this great opportunity, he knew, because the devil is in the details, that the way that it was set up is that they would have to sue me to get to him because he was my subcontractor. So it was a very, very difficult life lesson learned, but I say all of that to say you need to be careful when you're looking at setting up a co-founder relationship, that if something sounds too good to be true, doesn't mean it always is, but take another look at that. Because in my case, I never thought about the fact there was a trusting relationship there. I did not have it set up in my operating agreement. He was set up as a contractor, and that ended up, it could have potentially cost me a lawsuit. Thankfully, like I said, it didn't, but hopefully that spares some of you that potential scenario, because nobody wants to go through that. So key point to remember, again, you're going to keep hearing this, consult legal counsel, because again, making sure that you get that set up right the first time. And before you go into any type of a scenario, whether that's a contractor relationship or your founder, you just want to make sure that you have all of the legal pieces put together, and that takes good legal counsel. There are some things we can fake. Being a dentist or being an attorney, you can't. So the next one is worst case scenario logic. It's not you, it's me, which really means it's you. So what I mean by that is my co-founder isn't performing up to expectations. So it's not me, it's you, and you're trying to figure out how to actually make this where you have an amicable breakup when someone's not performing like they're supposed to. So your co-founder, let's say that they are supposed to be your chief marketing officer or your operations person, they're not performing. What are you supposed to do with that? You're stuck with them now, you're in this relationship. So how do you manage that when your co-founder is not performing the way that they're supposed to? So there's a couple things that you can do. First is use a vesting schedule for your equity. Again, this is outlined in your operating agreement. So rather than immediately creating a relationship with a co-founder where you are automatically giving them half your company and dividing it, create a vesting schedule, have them earn the equity that they have, and put a cap on that. The next piece is tie the equity to performance criteria. Make sure that those are very clear criteria, because vague is not good when it comes to an operating agreement. And certainly not when it comes to the law, because if it's vague, it's going to be 50-50 on who that judge might side with. So tie your equity to performance criteria, be very clear about what those are. And then do your research, because prior legal issues can be an indicator. And I'm going to say this going back to my prior example. I did actually do my due diligence. So I did a really good legal search prior to when I very first met my co-founder, and there wasn't anything legally. So I felt like I was in the clear. Now, it was several years before I actually brought him on as my co-founder. It's just when I initially started working with him on development. As it turns out, after I uncovered the situation with him, if I had gone back right when I started the company and created it and looked up to see if there was anything, he actually had 3 legal lawsuits against him in other cities and states for fraud, and it totaled a couple $1 million. So when I actually went to try to sue him, I was not able to, because I would have been last in line. So I would have spent a lot of money legally just to track down someone who I would have been last in line. So the moral of the story is even if you've checked, check again. Just make sure it's well worth it to double check and make sure that you have done all of your due diligence and research. It certainly is something that would have spared me a lot. The highlight of that story, though, is even though I was not able to benefit from the fact that I uncovered all of those things, I did actually help the person who was first in line on that, and I actually was deposed, testified against that person, and they are now no longer able to mess with anyone again. So there was like a highlight to that story. He did not continue to go. It didn't benefit me, but it did benefit other people. So do your research, make sure that you're looking to make sure that you have checked. Most states have a website where you can actually do some searches, and there's some national searches. It's worth it. I would have caught it had I done the same searches just a couple years later. So for what it's worth. And then document. I'm going to give you an example. Thankfully, this one is not mine, of a company that I've worked with just as an advisor. And they brought on someone because they were looking for basically a co-founder who could do the kind of CMO role and do all the marketing. And when they brought that person on, they actually did do a legal search. And that person was also very transparent to say, hey, I am in a legal battle with my former employer. And, it's unique to this situation and everything else. And they bought in. They just said, okay, great, I understand. A little bit of time passes, and what's actually the case in that scenario is that the same thing is happening again. So there was a pattern there. So basically that person had a legal battle with former employer, is now setting up this person for the same type of thing. And because they're aware of the previous legal battle, they know what they're about to step into. And so again, not saying that you should not give people the benefit of the doubt, but when you are starting a company, it is already like so many things against you. And when you add one more variable, like your co-founder is now, the person that you're battling with, it is so difficult to get through and get past that. And it can tank your company right out of the gate. So document. In that case, that is what I said to that founder. I just said, you need to document everything, because in the event that you guys do go your separate ways, which is inevitable, you're going to need to have it documented every step that you tried to show that you were making that relationship work. Again, if you think about it and you go back to your operating agreement, breaking down and having it be where that equity is earned gives you that runway to make sure that the relationship is going to last. So that is... It's not you, it's me. Next is the widower. So co-founder dies. Not one that happens frequently, but I've actually seen it happen. And so what do you do when your co-founder dies? This is one where, again, you want to make sure that your operating agreement, again, legal counsel, make sure your operating agreement discusses this. What happens to the equity in the company should your co-founder die? Does it stay with the company? Does it go to the next of kin? How does that get handled? It should be in your operating agreement. But two, this is where insurance is really valuable. And this is what came into play in the example that I have, which is the co-founder died. They had a key man life insurance policy, which allowed them to be able to maneuver through this without a whole lot of risk to either person. So make sure that you're thinking through, again, best case and worst case scenarios as you are going through finding your co-founder. So you guys have made it through. We're through the worst part. So summary, operating agreement always is going to cover the dispensation of stocks and ownership. You need to be careful to cover who owns any of your intellectual property. And just as a side note, usually the IP is assigned to the actual business entity. And it should outline each partner's responsibilities for liabilities as well. Again, I can't say it enough. Consult legal counsel. So next, now that we got through the hard stuff, so we've talked about what happens if you break up. Now we just need to talk about, do you actually need a co-founder? So for the people who are in the room who did not raise their hand that they have a co-founder, anyone want to shout out why they don't have a co-founder? Or if you're looking for a co-founder, raise your hand or shout out why you don't want to have a co-founder. Yeah.
Because I had one.
And I'm going to guess it didn't go great? Yeah. Okay. Yes.
I
have an advisor or enough mentors around me that like a co-founder I didn't feel was necessary.
You must be a part of Pipeline. Okay, so typical reasons that someone needs a co-founder or chooses a co-founder. First, you have the technical co-founder. A lot of times there's kind of this misconception that if you are a non-technical founder, you have to have a technical co-founder. And I will say that a lot of times when you get to exit, that is something that, especially if you're a tech-based company, may be something that your acquiring company will want to look at and have. However, by that point, you'll have a CTO. You do not, it is an old wives' tale that you have to have a technical co-founder if you are a technical-based company. You need to have a really strong development team and a CTO, but it doesn't mean you have to have a technical co-founder. Next is your resume building co-founder. So this is what happens when you feel like you are a little bit unsure of the territory that you're in. So you're like, this person has an amazing resume. They know all of the people that I need to know. It's a critical person. That doesn't make it wrong for you to find someone who's a resume builder for your co-founder. Could be a great fit. Also, it's just one of the other areas that you just need to be aware of, that you don't have to have a resume builder as a co-founder. You can actually put together an advisory board that really meets that need of building out your Rolodex of people that are in your industry. So we've got the resume builder co-founder. Next is the I can't do this alone co-founder. And this is typically when we're insecure, that we're coming from this place of I can't do this by myself. There's so much work that needs to be done. I know what I'll do. I'll get a co-founder because that will make it better. And I think the majority of the people in this room that have like raised their hand or made a comment can all attest that that does not always go that way. Sometimes you really are better off doing it alone. Doesn't mean, again, these are not reasons not to have a co-founder. They're just the typical reasons we see when someone feels like they need to have a co-founder. And then the last is like what I like to refer to as the guilt co-founder. So this person has done so much for me that I have to make them my co-founder because they've helped me, they've been with me from the beginning, and now they're looking at me saying, well, now what? So it's the guilt reason for having a co-founder. Again, when you think about all the ways that this can go south, it needs to be the exact right person for there to be any chance of it working out. And so just because someone helped you a lot doesn't make them a good co-founder or the right choice for you to have as a co-founder. So bottom line, do you really need a co-founder? Or do you need a really strong advisory board and a really great C-suite team of executives around you? Those are the questions to ask. Again, I'm not here giving legal advice or any other type of advice, just trying to say that you have that choice. So you don't have to have a co-founder. And if you do, just make sure that you're finding a co-founder for the right reasons. So next on our list is, how do I find a co-founder? So after all of this, we've gone through worst case scenario, we've gone through the reasons why you might want, like, how do I even find one if I decided I want one? So start with questions. One, going back to the previous slide, do you really need a co-founder? Ask yourself that a lot. You're doubling the amount of people in your organization by having a co-founder, and you're doubling the ways that can go south because you now have two people who are trying to figure something out. So going back to the previous slide, if yes, what do I need them for? So again, as I was saying, you might have a co-founder who's your resume builder. That's not wrong. Just when you're thinking about how to break out in your operating agreement what their roles and responsibilities are, make sure it highlights those. So if it's a technical co-founder, tie that equity to technical requirements. If it is a resume builder for marketing, just tie everything back to those equity pieces need to tie back to something. So make sure that when you're looking at what their job description is, that you're tying any equity to that. So, and then the last question is, where do I find them? So the one thing that I have always found that has served me well is sticking with my circle of trust. So for some people, that's the Pipeline family. For other people, that is your actual family and friends. Your circle of trust is the people who will tell you when you're doing something wrong or tell you when it's the wrong fit. Start with them. They have the most vested interest in seeing you succeed. So starting with those people to say, who do you know that might be a good fit? And by the way, here are the reasons why I'm looking for someone. I need someone who can help me get these connections, and my advisory board doesn't meet that need for X, Y, and Z reason, or I need to find someone who can help me technically. So make sure you're very clear on why you need that person, and then start with your circle of trust. Next is network within your network. So for an organization like Pipeline, we have a very large network. That's a gift. Not everybody has that, but everyone has some type of a network. So what you want to do is you want to find people who are in connection with your network. So if there's someone who's had recent success, let's say they've had an exit, or maybe they've just left a company, but they have a really great track record of success with startups in particular, start there. Get connected from your network. It's a lot better than the last case, which is blind date. Blind date is what you don't want to do. If you're going to just meet someone and say, hey, we just met, you don't know anyone I know, I don't know anyone you know, you better have a long timeline before you're about ready to start that company, because you're going to need that kind of time to see if that's a good fit for you, because it needs to be a personality fit. It needs to be a hustle heart fit where you're both working at the same pace. There's so many things that you need to align on. So if you're going to meet someone and say, oh, this person's a great fit, we just met over coffee, we love the same things, you better have a long, long, long runway on that. And then last is look for patterns of success. So within our Pipeline organization, we currently have some people who are not running a company and are trying to figure out what they're going to do next. I would bet on them every single time because they have a track record of success. So the fact that they're out there and they are currently looking for the next thing isn't a negative, because they have a track record of having successful companies. Doesn't mean they all got to exit. Some of the best entrepreneurs we have are people who haven't exited, have failed, started over again, and learned. So it doesn't mean necessarily that they have multiple exits under them. It just means they have a track record of success in building a company. Last section, how do you compensate your co-founder? I feel like this is one that we get a lot because there's a lot of different ways that you can do it. And I think that as in any conversation, when you're trying to structure something, try to think outside the box. You have to look at what works for you as well as what that person is willing to work with. So 4 different ways you can look at it. There's, again, a million different ways that you can do this, but the first is equity. So let's go back to the example where this person's put a lot of time in already. So there's an hourly rate or a salary that you could think of, how much time they've put in. This is how much they would have gotten paid in the market. Figure out what your company valuation is, put that together, and then you give them the time invested, what that amount is, and you divide, and that gives you a percentage of equity. That's one way that you could do that. It's a simple, clean, easy way to do it. The next is salary. So this is not something that most startups have the advantage of, where they have the funding to be able to just say, hey, let me go ahead and pay you a salary. So would love it if that's an opportunity for you, but that's not typically. The next is salary plus equity. This is where you give them a smaller amount of salary for a smaller amount of equity. And then the last, which is the one that I always like to recommend, is the trial period. Again, there are a million ways that this can go south. So having a trial period where, in other words, in order for them to earn equity, they go through a trial period where they have, you get to see if it works out, and their equity in the company is based on, again, certain criteria that they have to meet, that their equity is tied to. It gives you time to see if it's going to work out without immediately getting married. It's like a dating period. And then from there, you tie the equity to whatever you define, very clearly define these as what the criteria are that they have to meet in their job in order to get that next piece of equity. So, as a recap, we have talked about whether or not you actually need a co-founder. And this room, I think, would argue 50-50, maybe not. Next, we talked about how to find your co-founder. We talked about how to compensate your co-founder, and also worst case scenario, breaking up with your co-founder. So that went by very fast. Does anybody have any questions?
Let's give a round of applause for Melissa.
Thank you.
I will be navigating around with a microphone, and if you are online, please comment in YouTube or Facebook, and we will read your question aloud to get an answer for you, but we'll start here in the room.
Hi, Melissa. Thank you. For someone who's not familiar with Pipeline, what's Pipeline do and how do we join?
That's awesome. So you're going to go to apply.pipelineentrepreneurs.com or just go to pipelineentrepreneurs.com, find the apply section. So Pipeline, it's a fellowship for high growth entrepreneurs. And for the first time this year, we are actually offering 2 programs. So typically we only have one traditional program, and that is for people who are working on their startup full time. This year we started and we're recruiting for a second class that is for people who are not working yet on their company full time, because we recognize the need for underserved entrepreneurs that don't necessarily have an even playing field to get into Pipeline. They're earlier stage, they're still working full time. So we wanted to give them the ability to go through some earlier stage ideas and training and then be able to get into Pipeline. So yeah, it's a year-long fellowship. They go through. I'm looking at our people because I'm like, they can tell you better than I can. But it's it's industry agnostic. We take no equity in the startups that we work with, and we're founder first, which means we care about the founder because we know that serial entrepreneurs, people are going to get back up. If they have a failure, get back up, start again. Those who get back up have a success, they reinvest in their communities. And so they are really what drives the economy in the Midwest. And so we focus solely on them.
Is there a fee?
So there is, for the traditional Pipeline Fellowship, there's a $2,500 fee if you get in, which we offer scholarships for. For the new programming for underserved entrepreneurs, which is only virtual, there's no fee. And by the way, just for the sake of clarity, when we say underserved, it's rural entrepreneurs, female and minority entrepreneurs, for the sake of that. So who are not working on their companies full time. That's a great question.
I've got a question. For the question on whether or not I need a co-founder, does your answer change if I'm accepting outside investment or not?
It's a good question. Typically, outside investment to me is when you have your board, not necessarily a co-founder. If they're putting pressure on you, I'd be curious to know why and see if you could potentially kind of beef up your team, if that's the question. But typically with outside investment, less about the co-founder, more about your board and representation there. Any other questions?
Trevor made me go all the way to the other side, so he
Trevor.
waited until I stopped too. That was great.
It just worked out that way, but it was fun for everyone. Hi, Melissa. Great presentation. Quick question.
Trevor, yeah.
You know, I've been having some challenges hiring people lately, where I'm not able to compensate them what they want to be compensated. Don't necessarily want to make them a co-founder, but I'm willing to put them on a vesting schedule. I have no idea and I know this is a variable answer, but what's kind of standard what you see if you're going to pay somebody, if you're going to pull that lever where you pay somebody a discounted salary in order to get them in the business, and you put them on a vesting schedule, about how many years do they usually vest in to get their equity? And then the other part of that, is it like a 50-50 split that you see? I mean, I know there's no right or wrong answer, but what do you see?
Yeah, so typically not a 50-50 split, especially because like in your case, or in a case where your company is really well established as yours is. So if you're early stage, that's where that number tends to be higher on the equity percentage. The longer you've been going along and you're having these conversations, that number goes down as far as the equity.
So it would be not necessarily equity percentage, but like if I'm gonna hire you,
Yeah.
I couldn't afford you. But if I were to give you a percentage of my company, is it 50% of their salary?
Oh, I see what you're saying.
Right.
Yeah, so typically it's about, yes, that's a good split. So it's about 50% of the salary in exchange for a small percentage of equity. And then I always try to tie that back to a number somehow. So again, taking what they could earn in the market, figuring out like what that looks like as far as other employees who have equity. Like there's so many variables when you're an established company versus brand new, where you don't have any like track record. In a company that's established, you have to look at, do any of your other like C-suite teams, does anyone else have equity? And if so, how much? And then you have to figure in their perception if you bring in someone new and give them equity that's close to it. So it's like there's more variables to like consider. So it's like a lower number than the other people who've been all along. At the same time, depending on like, and that's where you can play with it. So let's say that you have a little bit more equity because you haven't taken outside capital, your cap table is a little bit cleaner, you have a little bit more equity to play with, which helps you go a little bit lower on the salary if cash flow is an issue. So it's like an intricate puzzle where you can just kind of play with the variables a little bit to get to where you need to be, both from a cash flow perspective and also keeping your cap table clean.
I had one more question.
Yeah.
So with the startups that you've seen that have had co-founders that were successful, are there any trends that you've seen of how those teams are formed, or maybe the decisions made of why they chose co-founder opposed to building a really strong team at the start?
Yeah. So it definitely can be successful. Interestingly enough, I've seen a number of successful husband-wife team. Sometimes, obviously, that doesn't always work, but a lot of times, or at least the times that I've seen co-founders be successful, it's a husband and wife team. They already know how to communicate. A lot of times they've had kids. I mean, you can get through having kids together. I mean, you can manage having a company. So a lot of times it's a husband and wife team, and it depends on what they're looking for. So the times I've seen it be successful, they're not actually looking for someone who's just like them. They're a founder who is willing to recognize that they can't be all things to all people, and they're willing to have someone who is different than them that plays a different role. It's harder to work out when you have two people that are doing this against each other versus two different people who are willing to say, I know that I'm not the operations person, I'm the visionary person. And if you can coexist in that and you balance each other out and work on each other's, like, this is a weakness, I know this is my strength, and you appreciate that about each other, that tends to be successful. It's when it is, no, we're doing it this way. I mean, it's like this delicate dance, just like in any relationship, where sometimes one person is leading and the other person wants to have an opinion. So who at the end of the day is going to have the final say? So I think the clearer you have boundaries around that, I think those relationships tend to be successful. Like, I am all about operations, I'm all about vision. If something comes to, like where there's a disagreement, if it's about operations, I'm gonna go with that person. If it's about vision, I'm gonna go over here. And that trust, it's when there aren't clearly defined boundaries that goes south super fast. So for what it's worth, I've definitely seen it be successful. I mean, having a co-founder is not all bad. There's just a lot of ways it can go south.
I would thank you for what you had to say. I would just share two things. One, just to reiterate, I started a company with a friend from college, and we were together 5 years. We had no operating agreement, no legal agreement on what our exit strategy was or where we were going, but we were getting contracts and we were very successful at it. But it didn't end well, and that was why. So I just reiterate, you're exactly right on. Somebody told me, you're a fool for going this route. So, well, thanks for telling me now. You should have told me 5 years ago. But I would just say one of the things that we faced was not that we weren't successful, that we couldn't do business together well, but it became very clear that our values were very different. And he wanted to work into the ground. He was single, I was married, I had 5 kids, and I'm trying to be a dad and involved in church and everything else. And it's like, I don't want to work 300 hours a week. I just don't. I mean, a month. I just don't. And he just said, I'll keep working. I just want to make money. And it became clear that his strategy was actually not to build a long-term company, but he actually wanted to build a company that he could sell out in 3 to 5, about 5 years. So about the time we split up was when he was wishing we would have been at the point of selling, and I wasn't really interested in that. And I look back, it was a really dumb thing, but I was naive enough to not know. So anyway, just speak to the whole value side of where you're going and who you are and your integrity and things like that. Are you compatible?
That's such a good point. Absolutely. I mean, work ethic is a key piece of that, but that's all about, kind of your company culture, but also as founders, and kind of goes back to where those boundaries are. So, you have one person who is, hey, I'm going to take the company and I'm going to go like crazy. I'm going to work 300 hours a week because I don't have kids. And then the other person, as long as those are clearly understood, that can still work. It's when the expectations of the other person are different. So I'm working 300 hours, you now have kids. I'm not okay with that now. Why aren't you working 300 hours? Why are you having kids? Like, so I think it's all about setting those boundaries and clear expectations, and honoring those. And, honestly, having a business coach, AKA therapist in a lot of ways, is not a bad idea if you do have a co-founder, because sometimes, just like in relationships, you need a third party that can come in and kind of help you work through some issues, especially if you already have a co-founder and you're running into issues. Having someone that can help you walk through them and kind of provide that third party perspective is really valuable. And it allows you, again, if you're with that person, being able to and you want to continue that path, it's finding a great business coach who can help with that. I've seen that be really successful with relationships that really didn't seem like they were going to make it from a business perspective, and also ones that were clearly going south. It helped kind of make that breakup a little bit less severe.
Great advice on the coach. Thanks for pointing that out. The book Rocket Fuel goes into a lot of, visionary and integrator kind of issues. And I apologize, I didn't get in on the front end of this. So if you talked about this, just skip my question.
I did not.
But do you see trends in the highly complementary between those kind of integrator, visionary type co-founders versus two people that are friends and going down the same path and have a lot of the same skill sets? And just, do you have any insight on that?
That's a great question. And I think that there's a lot more resources now on, I think people are just more aware, probably, a lot, because we've made a lot of progress as a country and around mental wellness and awareness, but there's a lot more personality profiling that's out there, especially when it comes to running your company. And so we at Pipeline have a lot of our members use Culture Index as a way before they, find their team or their co-founder, to make sure, to your point, that it's a good fit there between someone who is highly detailed and your person who's a visionary. And we recommend that even with your team. I mean, we're talking about co-founders today, but you're, as a startup, you have a very small team. You want to make sure that as you're making those hires, they're people who actually fit the role. And you can't always tell that from an interview. So we utilize Culture Index on our team, and it's been very helpful for us to see if we're bringing on someone in accounting, that they're very detail oriented. If they were a visionary, that probably wouldn't be a good fit. And so to your point, yes, I think that happens a lot more. Yes, you still see people who are friends from college or the husband and wife team, but I think that people are more aware that there are tools out there to help them make an educated decision when they're finding a co-founder or looking for their executive team even.
Final call for questions. One more over here.
So I've already kind of gone through the process of having an advisory board, but at first starting with a co-founder. And just for future reference or maybe past reflection, I wanted to ask, are there any buffering questions you would ask your advisory board if you acquire one? At least I would personally, before I search for another co-founder for maybe a future startup or a future endeavor investment I may want to take. Are there any buffering questions you may want to ask them, or anything that really matters when, at least to the advisor's perspective, when the founder is choosing a co-founder? Is there anything like that you would suggest to take into account?
Well, to the previous question, I would absolutely, if I were on an advisory board, I would have them have potential co-founders go through something like a Culture Index, because it is real. If that person is coming into an already established, company, making sure that that's a good fit, because again, that's where those boundaries come into play. So having someone who's a visionary with someone who's very analytical and detail oriented, like, you want that balance. And at the same time, you need to make sure that there's an alignment there. So that way you don't have too much of an overlap. And that there's a recognition of, this is my role. And this is, because typically if you're the founder, you're the visionary, and then you're finding someone who's like the other side of that, the operations and the details. So one, from an advisory board perspective, I would absolutely want them to go through some type of a profile to make sure that there was a fit there. And then I think the other is really making sure that if you're bringing in a co-founder after you're already established, that they're bringing a lot of value to the table. So are they bringing connections? Are they bringing, kind of like that resume builder status. Like, what are the things that they're bringing? What are the know-how that they're bringing to the table that your advisory board doesn't already have? Again, thinking of your advisory board, when you're a startup, they're kind of like a little bit of an extension of your team. They're making connections and doing all those things for you, or they should be. And so, making sure that if you're going to bring on someone, that you're just looking at any gaps that you have.
When you're looking at a specific person, what are characteristics or parts of the relationship that you would examine to decide between a leader in your organization with equity and someone who would actually also have the title founder? Is there anything specifically that is kind of delineation there? Is that founder preference?
That's such a great question. I really do think a lot of it is about time. I think if you've been going along and you've been running the company, bringing someone along as a co-founder, man, they better bring a huge amount to the table. Otherwise, having them as, a C-suite person, a key leader in the company, it just sets different expectations. Sometimes that's just a conversation that someone is like, nope, it's co-founder or bust. Those actually make me nervous because I'm like, why is it, if you're stepping in later, why do you have to have that co-founder status? Because if I'm willing to compensate you with equity and salary, why do you need that? To me, that's a red flag, only because I've seen that happen where someone comes in, they're later to the game and they're like, I want to have the co-founder. And I've very rarely seen that be a good personality fit.
Last question.
All right.
All right, let's give another. Oh, nope.
Oh.
Right in.
I just have a quick question about, you had mentioned advisory, looking at advisory board, but when do you determine whether you need a board of directors versus advisory board?
So that's a great question. Typically, once you start raising capital, you're going to need to have a board. Because people who put money in the company are typically going to want you to have some type of a board of directors, to which the people putting money in are going to want a seat. Advisory boards are a great way to kind of what you're going after with the resume builder is I want people to see that it's not just me, but I'm not in a place necessarily where I'm ready to hire a team. So advisory board is fantastic because there's no voting rights, there's no anything like that. They're really there to be able to show kind of that resume piece. So I have people who are in my industry who are volunteering their time for this company and for me. And so it shows a commitment from industry leaders, which means something. You're not giving up anything because it's not a voting board, it's just an advisory board. And typically it's a great transition to kind of get into that setup before you actually have to have a board of directors, which is when you start taking investment.
All right, one last round of applause for Melissa. Thank you.
Thank you.
Our very own Wichita Startup Week batch of small batch coffee. Thank you so much. All right, next session is in about 17 minutes. Jason Ilian, Disrupting Big and Small. We'll be back here right in this room, back here on YouTube and Facebook. So we'll see you soon. Thank you.